Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. Quite unbelievably, this is actually episode 17, which I think Claire and I are both quite shocked that we've done so many episodes. Thank you so much for listening, because our numbers are going up every week, which is great because it means the campaign has a much greater sense of idea of success. So thank you very much for listening. So this week we're going to kick off the way that we often do, where we're going to talk about some of the witches that were charged and executed. So Claire, can you give us some details about the witches for this week, please?
Yes, sure. The women killed as witches, I've looked up three from different sources. The first is Marion Dwyn. Now, I don't quite know how to pronounce it. The surname is spelled Dwne. So I don't know whether that's a recorded spelling error and it's just been recorded in history as that there's been some kind of mistake, or that is actually her name. We know that in 1594, she was sent to trial as a witch. And what's recorded about her was, and again, this is something that we find very often, she was female, she was unmarried, and unfortunately for Marion, when she went to trial, she was convicted and she was thereafter executed as a witch, so strangled and then burned. And the only other thing that we know is that trial took place in Long Niddry. So that's all the information we have about Marion. Another woman that we want to tell you about is one that I looked at and read about in Heather Upfield's booklet. This is the booklet we've spoken about before. It's published by Kilwinning Heritage, and Heather Upfield has written it. It's called 5 Women of Kilwinning. What is known about this woman, the information that Heather has gathered together, is that her name is Margaret Isset. Isset. There's very little information available about Margaret. It said that she had a local trial, which I think would have been in Kilwinning, and the trial ended on the 30th of April 1650. And that trial ended, and it says in brackets, she having made her confession. So Margaret actually made her confession. That was recorded in the minutes of the presbytery of the kirk, and Heather actually has copied out for us to see the part confession of Margaret, and it goes in the following way. Sick like of Margaret Isset in Kilwinning, who had confessed ilk ane one of them to their guiltiness of the sin of witchcraft, and after examination of the foresaid confessions, they are found relevant to be recommended for issuing forth a commission to put them to assize. So what that was saying was that she'd made her confession at that point, and as a result of her confession, she was to be put to trial. And there isn't any further record of Margaret Isset, but she is presumed executed. Now, what I found particularly sad about this case is we have this very little information in relation to Margaret. We don't even know what the witchcraft was that she was said to have done. But what Heather has recorded is the name of, I think, no less than 12 men that were involved in the case as investigators against her. And I got the name of most of these men, but we're not going to mention them. We're just going to mention their involvement in the case was being as a result of being a minister. There are various different ministers of Largs, Kilwinning, Ardrossan, West Kilbride, Kilmarnock. So there were 12 ministers who were investigators against poor Margaret Isset. And as a result of their investigations, she went to trial and she was convicted. So we remember her too.
Claire, can I just ask, is that unusual in your reading and your research to have so many ministers involved in a case like that?
Yeah, I found it unusual. It usually records, where there is a record of it, 2 or 3 that I have seen. Now, I, of course, speak to be absolutely no expert in these sorts of things. I'm reading, so if anyone knows better, please do contact us and let us know. But I was struck by the fact that it was 12 investigators, and I don't really know why. It may be because if there's any allegation, for example, that Margaret was travelling around from area to area, then they
Right.
wanted the view of the local minister. But that's pure guesswork on my part. But because they're different ministers from different areas, Largs, Kilwinning or Drawson, West Kilbride, Kilmarnock, I'm not sure why they would have got involved in a local issue like that if it weren't for the fact that they had some input to have from their area. So I'm not really sure. So I was really struck by the amount of investigators against her in that case.
Yeah, and it just the thought of how intimidating that must have been for her, for Margaret Isset, to have 12 so-called investigators, 12 men of the church with that level of standing accusing her of that. Just like, just it's horrible.
Absolutely.
Just be so intimidating. Be bad enough if it was 1 or 2, but for there to be 12, that's really shocking.
Yeah. And of course, what annoys me and why I'm not reading them out is history records their full name. And we know their name and their job and what part they took place in it. But we know so little about poor Margaret herself. So I'm not continuing their names on. It's good that we record them, and it's good that I think Heather has recorded, because it's good to know this history. But just for purposes of our podcast, I don't think I'll bother reading them out. The final woman today that was killed as a witch was a woman called Catherine Muirhead. She went to trial in 1593. The last woman we have to speak about today who was killed as a witch was Catherine Muirhead. We know even less about her than we usually know, Zoe. We don't even know where the place was that she was executed. We only know her name. We know that she went to trial in 1593. We know that she is female, unmarried, and after trial she was executed. That's all. So Marion Down, Margaret Isset and Catherine Muirhead are the women that we remember today.
One of the things that happened this week on social media with the Twitter account was that one of our long-term listeners, Loretta Mulholland, posed an interesting question via a tweet, Claire.
Yes, it's a question that we've asked before and we've talked about before. But again, it's so interesting that people respond to it and the ways in which they respond. And Loretta tweeted, "If you'd been alive in the 16th or 17th century, would you have been accused of being a witch?" Great question in episode 16 of Witches of Scotland. So we just spoke about it in the last episode. And again, loads of people responded.
So, Claire, why do you think it is that so many women would say now when asked that question, and we know this, we've got tons of evidence of women getting back in touch with us about this and about people we've spoken to in actual real life that have expressed this idea. Why do you think so many women think, if it was now and there were witch trials now, I would definitely be accused as a witch?
I think that it's because the women that it resonates with are strong, maybe independently minded, feminist, that there are things in the modern day that would have been the absolute antithesis of what the church wanted from you as a woman at that time. So I suppose we're bringing our 21st century ethos and overlaying it on the top of what it would have been like at that time. But of course, if we had been alive at that time, we would have been very different. I mean, there would have been no such concept of feminism, I suppose. We would have been living in a world that was completely differently constructed.
Yeah, I know. And I think I sort of, on the one hand, you and I have obviously talked about this at length in the past about whether we think that we would have been accused as witches. And one of the things that I said was, well, if you're looking at sort of like the identifiers of that as being somebody who's like maybe mouthy and kind of strong and is annoying to people, then yes, I totally would have been, executed as a witch. But like, what would I have been like in those days? Would I have just kept my head down and just, behaved properly? Properly is obviously in inverted commas. It's really hard to tell because we just don't know really what women acted like in those days. We've got some interesting conversation coming up with a forthcoming guest that you'll hear in the forthcoming weeks, where we have some information about one particular woman who was accused. And it sounds, to me, I think maybe this is where the discomfort I have with this conversation is sometimes is that a lot of the time it seems to be that it wasn't necessarily that women were these like remarkable, strident feminists that we sort of think of now. It might have just been that they just were strange in some way, or that there was women in their community that for whatever reason, were against them and were gossipy and, took their power from taking away somebody else's power. So it's kind of a strange one, isn't it, Claire?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, we do know that some people were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
We know that people were outsiders in the sense that they perhaps didn't have the support of the community. We know that people were called witches for reasons of pettiness, and once an allegation had took hold, it was very difficult to shake. But we didn't need to be bullshit or loud or opinionated or anything like that for those allegations to have happened. And really the totally sad thing about it is, when we say now, do you think that you would have been killed as a witch back then? The answer to that probably is yes, because it's as likely as any of us that would have been killed as a witch back then. It didn't really matter what you brought to things. You were under suspicion of, acting in a way which wasn't godly. That just must have been horrific.
So maybe really the criteria then was, would you have been accused of being a witch? Really all you really needed to have was just, a female anatomy. That to a great extent, that might have been like the one piece of criteria was you're a woman, and as long as you were a woman, you were unsafe,
Indeed, and the reason for that was, of course, Julian Goodyear told us about it much earlier, was that they believed that women were less able to fend off the devil, that they were weaker. And therefore they wouldn't be able to resist the devil's advances, and the devil would be able to trick them into doing his bidding. And, it was all based on the fact that men would be much more likely to be able to resist the devil. And that's why it was particularly women that were got. So underlying it was the clear understanding is that women were not as intellectually able as men to resist the devil. That was the underlying theory of all. And of course, as Julian Goodyear said, because the devil was a man, then, there was this whole perverse sexuality wrapped up in it as well, that of course women would want to have sex with the devil, or the devil would want to have sex with women. That added again to the narrative, of course, why it would be a woman, because the devil was always a man.
Yeah, of course. And it's just that's why I think it still resonates, as you used that word, which I think is really good for this. It really still resonates with women because we're not in a position where women can just kind of do their own thing and be quite happy with that. We both know that quite often when you raise your head above the parapet in different ways, particularly unfortunately with social media, and we all know that sort of the problems with social media and anonymity, and that people feel emboldened by being, not in the same room as somebody else, and all the nonsense that's spoken on social media, that is the playground now where women can be just horribly attacked. And it tends to, it's not just, I disagree with your idea, or, you've got no understanding of what you talk of. It's not just that. It's that often it's accompanied by really, really grotesque sort of sexual commentary and, violence, threats of violence, things like that. And we see it happening again and again and again, particularly played out on social media. So I think that's something that we'll come back to maybe in later episodes. But I think for me, I think that's why so many women connect with this idea, is because our coat is still on a shaky peg in many ways. Yes, we might not actually be strangled and burned, but we're still not feeling completely at ease and stable in our position in society.
Indeed, and when you say, yes, we're not strangled and burned, the unfortunate thing is, of course, women are much more likely to be victims of violence in some settings. We're more likely to be victims of violence, such as in the domestic setting. So, there is, again, still a fear that exists in women. I think that's the underlying resonance
that keeps shuddering through the generations. Is this fear that as a woman that you're not entirely safe, and you should be, but you're not. And I think that's what clicks with women, is the fact that at any moment, because of your sex, you're in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, there was a thing on Twitter where somebody had discussed with their boyfriend how they didn't feel safe walking down the road, and he was amazed that they didn't feel safe walking down a street on any given day, and that they'd got sort of ideas about how if someone came up to them, they would clench their key between their fingers to make a makeshift sort of implement if someone tried to attack them, and their partner was absolutely amazed that they thought this. They didn't realise that this was what went through women's heads. And again, there was an outpouring of women saying, yeah, we think that all the time. We're scared all the time. We think about when we're walking alone down a dark street, if someone is following us, we're worried about that. That level of underlying fear is an odd thing to live with.
Yeah. So I think I can completely see why there's just an immediate connection for women with this issue, and with understanding what had happened in the past, and thinking about it in more clear terms than we're brought up thinking about it. I think that's why it's so interesting to people. You've said before that there's no, what was the quote about justice? That there's no
time limit on justice.
Yeah, I think that's why people connect with it.
I hope so. Well, I hope everyone out there who is listening does connect with it and supports the idea that we should have justice for these women.
Yeah,
I'm sure if you're listening to us talking, you're already halfway there.
Yeah, for sure. So we can now lead on to this week's guest, who is absolutely fascinating and knows a great deal about these issues that we're talking about. Claire, would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes, we are joined today by the fabulous Karen Strang. She is an artist who has for a long time been involved in the questions of what it was like for women at the time of the witch trials to have been alive, and what they would have felt, what they would have seen. And she has considered all these things and turned them into amazing pieces of visual art. Her artwork I have only been able to see so far in a book that she has sent me called The Burn and the Tide. And it's a great book because not only it shows Karen's work, but there are also interviews with her and with other people who were involved in the process. And I've really, really enjoyed it. And without further ado, let's introduce you to the fabulous Karen Strang.
Welcome, Karen.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on. I think your podcasts are fantastic, and the whole project is amazing. So I'm delighted to be in this talk today.
Can you tell our listeners a wee bit about what you do and who you are?
Sure. So I'm a visual artist. I trained as a painter, and I've been involved in looking at the theme of Scottish witchcraft and Scottish witchcraft trials for decades now. That's how old I am. So in the mid-1990s, I got the opportunity of working with a group of other local artists in the Stirling area on a project in the toll booth, what was the old toll booth before it was redone as a fantastic music space. And we got into the building, and it triggered these ideas of women who had been imprisoned. And then that's when the research really got off the ground. I had a look at the various trial records for Stirling at the time. And really that was the, if I could say, inspiration for continuing along that vein of work throughout. So although I do other types of painting and other types of installation and video in the past, I've always come back to the witchcraft trials, and particularly the local witchcraft trials. I grew up in the central belt of Scotland, And the place is basically hoaching with witchcraft trials. But of course, I'm that generation where we never really told about it. It wasn't on the curriculum at school. Nobody much spoke about it. And it's really just, I think, in the last 15 years that more and more information has been emerging slowly. So I grew up most of the time, I say, because I've moved around as a child, in Clackmannanshire. And that's a place that is really so many witchcraft trials that are coming to light in what is the smallest county in Scotland. And it's a very good place to start on the research because it's, in a sense, confined within a small space so that the research information is within the sort of boundary of maybe, say, 10 miles all round as the crow flies. And I thought originally I'm going to stick with that. However, as you'll know, these trials did spread over into what was then different parishes. And then I found that I was looking at West Fife because obviously Alloa is on the Firth of Forth, and then you travel down towards Curris and Toryburn and Newmilns and across the water to Bo'ness. And all these places had connections with various witchcraft trials. So the net was slightly spread. To go back to the beginning, I have to mention that the person that really inspired me to go back and do some really fulsome research on the Clackmannanshire witchcraft trials is the late Jeanette Archibald. She was an historian, a playwright, a curator, and born and bred in Alloa. And she was very, very passionate about bringing voice back to these women. And I think if she was alive today, she would certainly be one of the people in the forefront working alongside you to get some memorial for these women. And it's her spirit that's kind of been driving me on, really, to continue. We collaborated, Jeanette and I, back in about 2000. And she wrote a play, which her daughter, who is a writer as well, is hoping to sort of highlight as well at some point.
Is this The Devil's Mark?
That's correct, yeah.
I've seen it, yeah. Yeah, well, I haven't
we've retweeted a few things they've been putting up recently. Is that a new Twitter account that they've got? Is it a new thing?
So.
Yeah.
I think so. That's Hazel. That started off as a play, and I got involved with that. From then on, I just got very much involved. And unfortunately, we both actually ended up very ill at the same time, and then that kind of put a stop to taking it further. And when I did get back to looking at the Glendevin witchcraft trials, which has been my baby for the last 5-6 years, I've been doing that again very much on my own with the research. And yeah, so that's where I'm at the moment. I'm working currently on looking at developments within that Glendevin trial.
And is that the work that culminated in the Burn in the Tide?
Well, that's part of it, yes. However, I should say that before I got to that stage, I then worked with, and I'm still working with, a fabulous writer and performer, Catherine McFarlane. And in 2015, we did some research. Now, when I say research, we're not doing it academically. We're doing it as creatives, as artists. So the first thing we did was we went to the sites that we felt would maybe explain to us something of the feelings that these women might have felt. So we went to Curris and Toryburn. We walked around just to get a sense of what that place would have been like back in the 17th century. And from that, we decided to work on a collaborative piece, a small-scale piece, which was at Curris itself. And that was with Lindsay at the gallery that she had at the time. And the name of that project was Voices from Ashes. Now, we're currently working on Voices from Ashes 2, and that's based around the giving voice to the women that were accused and executed of witchcraft in the Toryburn, Newmilns, Curris area.
It's a great name. It's a really good evocative name. I think as soon as you start to know anything about the witch trials, you're just like, oh God, yeah, of course. Yeah, it's brilliant. We'll put links to your work so that listeners, if they're not already familiar with what your work is like, that they'll be able to follow and have a look there and see what you do. But until they see that, could you describe what you work in? I mean, you said you trained as a painter. So are these paintings we're talking about?
Yes. So I returned to full-time painting about 10 years ago. And prior to that, I was working in installation and performance. And all my work is connected in some way to what I call herstory, women's herstory, and a lot of it is connected directly to witchcraft trials. But in the last few years, I've decided to go back to my traditional roots. And that's been great in the sense that it's really helped me understand the language of the landscape. And the landscape is very important, I think, to give a kind of background to the trials visually as well as obviously historically. And I discovered that the landscape itself was very much part of the ideas of land control power, the proto-industrialisation of Scotland. And basically, if you were to overlap the areas where there were hubs of trials, you could see that there was also coal mining and salt panning, as well as rural agricultural communities there. And the women, certainly in the Firth of Forth up to Alloa, that area, they were very much involved in the salt panning industries. And these two industries are kind of, they work together. You need one for the other. But I didn't realise that salt panning was an absolutely disgusting thing to be involved in. It involved blood, boiling blood. Not human blood, obviously, but cattle blood in order to purify the salt. And it apparently stank. And basically, you think now we've got industrialised, smoky landscapes. Back then, the whole of the Firth of Forth would be just covered in this horrible, smoky, smelly mist. You'd think, oh, well, I'd rather do salt panning than be a coal miner any day, but I don't actually think it was it was any better. And of course, think of places like Salem, which also started as a salt panning port area. So there are links, if you think about it. And the more I kind of looked into the connections between, let's say, the landscape and what the landscape can throw up, such as the sea coal. And of course, you've got King James, who was very much interested in trying to extract coal from that kind of low-lying seam. So, yeah, there's all these links with power, with money, control. And of course, one of the aspects, I think obviously the majority of women who were accused of witchcraft then didn't have voice because they were illiterate. Although Scotland was apparently the most literate country in Europe at the time, the discrepancy between men who were literate and women was so big. And most women couldn't read or write. One of the positive aspects, I suppose, and you can call it positive, of it being not just about working women, but all women were kind of could be cast as a witch, was that the gentry meant that these women could actually afford to have legal representation. And that's how we know, I think, of some of these trials and how these women were treated.
Yeah, I was absolutely fascinated when I was reading the book that you sent me about the detail that you went into to inform your art pieces, in particular the communication between the land and the art that you produced. It was quite amazing to me, the effect that had, and the fact that when you started considering it, you actually were drawing landscapes to start with. That was part of the process, to orientate yourself, as it were.
Yes, I'm not a landscape painter. And, it's Joseph Beuys, the great artist, always said, to paraphrase him, always paint what you're uncomfortable painting. And for me, landscape was the thing I just wasn't interested in doing. And I just initially forced myself to go out there. And it's not a pretty landscape, generally. Firth of the Forth, you think, oh, that's going to be nice. But it's not. Most of it at Toryburn, Newmills, is very industrialised, and you can't actually access the coastline. You're sort of these lagoons, and they're not nice lagoons, they're industrialised lagoons. And I remember Catherine and I taking this long walk, and walking is a great way just to get the creative juices flowing. So the two of us were just taking this walk. Neither of us were enjoying the walk as such. We both felt it was very oppressive. You've got on the one side this big fence up saying do not enter, and on the other side you've got the hills, and you feel very enclosed. And it gave us that sense of what these women must have felt like. They didn't have the industrialised fencing, but they would have had all that smoke and boiled blood rising up. And it's just very evocative of what you could imagine the hell of the 17th century, how it would be portrayed.
I was really affected by the landscapes. I mean, there are one or two other pictures that I want to speak to you about, but I was surprised at how oppressive, and I think that's the word, oppressive. They were just dark and craggy, and it looked dangerous. It did not look like a safe place to be. I just felt that came across really, really strongly.
Yes, so the landscape was paramount. It's understanding that landscape for me really kind of explained not just about how these superstitious events triggered a horrible execution of women, but it also explained to me where these women were living, how they were, and bearing in mind they didn't have the voices that we have. They hadn't the possibility to articulate in a very patriarchal system. So women have always been traditionally the healers, the carers, even to this day. And of course, that's an element that I think carries through, but I'll talk about that maybe later if I get a chance. The fact that these women were very intelligent, had a lot of wisdom, and were crucial in the maintenance of these communities. But because they were not part of that male empowerment dominating the whole control of the communities, they literally had no voice. And how then could they have explained or said this is not right, or that there's no justice here? So that's why I thought, well, although I think there is a very political aspect to this, that the majority of the women were, let's say, didn't have anything. Economically, they had no control, no power. There was that sweep that women of the gentry were also scooped up as well. And that's where I got to that point of they did have representation in the courts. And in some cases, they actually were not executed. They were saved. But the treatment of all these women seemed to me to be equally horrible. Whether you were a lady or whether you were a worker, you could expect to be deprived of all basic human needs, food, and of course sleep deprivation. And sleep deprivation was a very big, for me, it was one of the most fascinating aspects of the torturing of these women. And you know yourself, if you've had a bad night or 2 bad nights, you go crazy. And you imagine you're in this space and you've not been able to sleep. And of course, some of them were actually physically forced to lean against things that meant that if they slumped down, they would, cut themselves open. And so it wasn't entirely even an emotional or psychological torture. There was a physical aspect to it. So that got me thinking, what is it like to have this disassociation? And I think that's what can happen if you're put in that position of fear and stress and sleep deprivation. You then become disassociated with reality. And that's what some of the paintings then wanted to express. So there's a series of 5 very large paintings that I then did. And these paintings were life-size. So the figures in them are life-size. And the idea was that I was confronting the figures, so that in a sense that I was listening to them talking back to me. And I actually put myself into a kind of sort of state of almost like a trance when I was painting them. And I think that's why I got this feeling that I could connect in some way to how these women must have felt. No one knows absolutely, but for me, that's a way in of trying to understand the absolute horrendous nature of these trials.
You're putting yourself in a very sort of vulnerable place there, visiting that. You're really exposing yourself to the worst of it by placing yourself in that position. Did it affect you?
Yes, I absolutely did. And I think as a painter, people don't realise maybe sometimes that painting is quite it's a very physical process as well as a mental one. And when you're painting large scale, when you're painting so that you're having to sweep your whole arms and your whole body in order to reach up to get one corner or another, and using large paintbrushes, it becomes quite almost like a performance as well, a very active piece of work. It was very physically demanding, and I pushed myself physically because I wanted to create these paintings as quickly as I could. I was fortunate enough, I had a large room, a very large empty white room where I work in Alloa, my studio. And I just placed these 5 canvases all around the room and locked myself in the room and just painted. It took days and days and days to do, but I just basically put myself, and almost as if I was containing myself, that I couldn't get out of this room, that there was a canvas propped against the door, so I couldn't get out, and just painting, basically. So obviously it's much more comfortable and I could get out if I wanted to, but it gave me some sense of what it must be like to be in a space where you don't have anything but yourself in that space, and what can you create. And of course these women didn't even have a piece of charcoal to sort of scrub an image on the floor with. They were completely deprived of everything.
Did you plan those images? What came from those 5 big pieces, if you can tell the listeners what images came from that?
So I thought about the tides at the Firth of Forth. And the Firth of Forth is unique, I believe, in that it has a double tide. So instead of having 2 tides, it actually has 4 tides, which is very unusual. And depending on the moon, obviously, and the weather and the seasons, sometimes these secondary tides are much more obvious, and sometimes they're less obvious. But this can create problems for fishermen, let's say, if they're not used to the fact that there's going to be another tide on top of the usual tide. And it was actually a friend of mine, Murdoch, who's a sailor, and he's got a boat out in Lime Kilns, that told me all this, and this was fascinating. And so this might be another reason why the Firth of Forth is also redolent with witchcraft and superstition and women taking sailors away and killing them. It's a very dangerous place to be, the Firth of Forth, at the wrong time. So I used the aspect of the tides and the levels of the water against the sandbanks to create the initial composition. Because I was thinking, if these women were incarcerated in Couris, and say they did have a wee window looking out, they would maybe see the tides coming in and out. That's a possibility. They wouldn't see much else. But that's a sense of movement that they may have seen. They certainly would have seen it anyway when they weren't incarcerated. And I thought, I'm going to use that aspect, the rhythm of the tides, to, in a way, pin down these 5 paintings in a kind of visual way. And of course, with tides, you've got movement, you've got wave movement. And with wave movement, you've got sound movement. So then there's that almost synesthetic aspect you get when I think you're contained in a space and you start to hear sounds. You can visualize them, or you can sense things in different ways. So you can feel sounds or see sounds. So that was another aspect I wanted to bring across. And that again ties in with the landscape, the very specific landscape of, let's say, the Firth of Forth.
Amazing stuff. And you said that it took you days to complete that particular part. Did you move on, once you had the 5 big pieces, did you move on to further pieces?
Yes, although I would say that the 5 largest pieces are the most abstract works. And abstraction in painting is the most difficult thing to achieve. It's much more easy to represent something as you see it. So I came to these quite near the end of my research. And by research, I mean most of the research I did was literally in the field. So I'd be walking around, traipsing about, and then doing lots of landscapes based on coven sites or sites where the women live. And then when I got to these large 5 pieces, that was based on all the kind of information that I kind of accumulated within, as well as in sketches and paintings of that landscape.
The burn, was that about the burning of women?
You know, there's so much ambivalence and ambiguity in everything. And in art, definitely, everything is blurred at some point. It's very difficult to find So the title, The Burn and the Tide, it's an ambiguous title. So the burn refers not only to the burning, it refers to the south-running burns. And if you were discovered by a south-running burn, you could be accused of witchcraft and sent away.
Why was that? Why was that if you were found by a burn? Just because you were out with the area that you should have been, or you were doing something witchy in the woods, or?
Well, this is an interesting one. Again, there's so much supposition involved. Very few people have actually looked, I think, in great detail. The thing about the burns is, again, by the 1650s, most of Scotland, central belt of Scotland, was carved up by the landowners, and they could see potential for coal. But also, this is the start of hydropower. So you've got a south-running burn, and of course we're talking about a south-running burn from the Ochils running down into Glendevon. So all the burns are running south, if you see what I mean. They're running down towards the south, but they've got a lot of power.
The landowners became aware that where there was running water, south-running water, there was money to be made.
Exactly. And a lot of the smaller coven sites were near burns. And if you were found near a burn that you shouldn't be at, you could be accused of witchcraft. This included men as well. And I have this theory that they were maybe using the burn maybe to produce whiskey.
Another type of magic.
Another type. And also one, the oldest industrial distillery in the world, because only Scotland has whiskey, is on the Firth of Forth. So
I did not know that.
At Kennet Pans.
Of all the history, about whiskey and all the places that are mentioned, well, that's something for me. That's a new thing for me to research.
It's at Kennet Pans. It's just a ruin now, but I know the guy that owns the ruins, and he's very much into trying to get Scottish Heritage to really sort of look into this and do something with it.
Wow.
Anyway, that's beside the point. But in the sense that all the industries, there was also barley growing. So you've got your barley, you've got your alcohol, you've got your sheep. Very industrialised part of Scotland. So I reckon the reason why you weren't supposed to be found at a south-running burn was nothing to do with being with the devil, which is what they said. The devil's, at these south-running burns, and you're talking to the devil, you're having intercourse with the devil there. I think it was just basically, we're not going to let these peasants have control of this energy here. They can pay for that. So that was my supposition on it. But what is factual is that if you were found by the wrong kind of south-running burn, and you shouldn't have been there, you could have been executed for witchcraft. So that's why it's called the burn and the tide. And the tide obviously refers to the tide of trial cases as well, the tide of people coming through, as well as the tides.
I love those double meanings. In particular, one of the pieces of work that you have done in relation to the witch trials that I absolutely love is carnival. That also has a double meaning. If you can tell us what carnival means and what it's about. And I just picked this because this is my absolute favourite picture of them all that you've done. All of them are fantastic, but this one particularly resonates with me.
So the painting carnival is life-size. So all the heads are the same size as the head of the viewer. So the idea is that it's hung at head height so that you could actually converse with those people. But not only that, you could embed yourself into that crowd if you wanted to.
Just to explain to people, what we're looking at is a huge canvas with the heads of women. Is it women and men?
There is one man in there. This was developed because when I did a call out originally, about a year previously, saying to people, I'm going to do this painting, and does anybody feel that they would have been accused as a witch if they were around? So I got lots and lots of people saying, I would have been accused as a witch, I'm left-handed, I'd be accused as a witch, I'm gay, I'd be accused as a witch because I'm too intelligent. So I had all these people, and for whatever reason, they felt they would have been persecuted for being a witch.
Do you feel that you would have been persecuted?
I think so, yes.
So do I, and so does Zoe. We put a shout out on Twitter asking exactly the same thing. How many people thinks if they were about in those days they would have been accused of witchcraft? We had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people agreeing with us. And it was quite incredible, wasn't it, Zoe?
Mm. It's a funny thing, that, the concept of it, because I think that modern women, like ourselves, actually quite like to think of themselves in those terms. Not that they would want to be, obviously killed or accused for being a witch, but that it's a sort of a mark of pride to think I would be out with the norm. I'd be othered for whatever my, like you've just said there, Karen, a wee list of some reasons why. But I think that a lot of modern women like to think, I'm a strong woman, and that's why I think that I'd be persecuted. It's an interesting thing, sort of taking strength from when women absolutely had everything taken from them, power-wise.
It's such a connection with them. It's such a connection that modern women feel this connection with these women who were in a very different circumstance from them and had nothing. So that's amazing. So you put a shout out for people to, do you think you've been killed as a witch? And you must have got a huge response, I imagine.
I did. And what I did then was I brought them into my studio and I sat them down and I did a portrait of them. And I asked them to talk about why they thought they would be a witch and their connections with it. And from that, I ended up with all these portraits of what you'd call very representational portraits, but quite sketchy, not with a huge amount of detail. And then I did what's called a cartoon. And a cartoon is basically a large-scale study for a larger painting. And when I did the cartoon of them, their faces started to be even less like they were and started to take on a kind of strange otherness about the faces. And then finally, in the final painting, I let the paint talk. I just let the paint do the work. I call myself a brush pusher. I just let the paint work for me. And again, you can only do that if you kind of put yourself, this sounds very pompous and silly, I know, but you have to kind of put yourself in that kind of trance to get to that stage where the paint is doing the work for you. I used a very limited palette and I work in oils. And I work in oils because oil paint is made of ground down pigment. And most of that pigment is ochres and oxides. And these are the oldest pigments that have been used by human beings for painting with. And the pigment in ochre is the same pigment that makes our blood red. It's the same substance, same chemical. So again, I give carnival of blood, of iron. And then the carbon, the black paint, is made out of burnt wood. And the white is made out of chalk. And all these minerals are found in our ground and found in our land. So I use that very limited palette to create that painting.
When you look at the painting, you see the visualisation of a number of faces, just faces staring back at you. And as you move out from the centre of the painting, the identity of the people becomes less strong. The picture becomes less strong. What was your thinking behind that?
You might notice there's one blank face in there. That's the viewer's face. That's yourself. You project yourself into that face. And the idea behind that was that when I started doing research in Glendevon, I went to the village, the Crook of Devon, and I spoke to the innkeeper there, who's a fantastic guy, and he gave me so much information about local. We're talking about a few generations back, but these people, families of the people that were either accused or the accusers, still live in that settlement, and that's interesting. And that brought me to mind that years and years ago, I went to Bosnia and I went to a wee village there and the people were living side by side. And although that had only been one generation back, the accusers and the accused were still living side by side. And I thought that's a very similar setup to what was happening back then. This isn't superstition. This isn't Grimm's fairy tales. This is history, or herstory as I call it. This happened. And these people are still living with their ancestors in their ancestors' homes, so to speak, the same land, the same names, the same genes. And that to me was both interesting, but also quite sad as well, that for some people that legacy would be seen as negative and for some people positive. But it's almost like that's flipped now. Because I think at one time to accuse someone of being a witch would have put you in a position of power. And now it's the people that are the ancestors, whose ancestors were accused as witches. They now feel a sense of pride. And they're saying, well, yes, my family were witches and I'm going to take that on board as a positive thing. So there's some interesting I don't know, I'm not a sociologist, but I find there's some interesting sociological jiggery-pokery going on there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like, as Zoe says, that the pride that modern women feel that they would have been called witches is the same sort of ideas that, you know, the pride that we've had people contact us on social media from Salem, from as far away as Salem, talking about witch trials, saying, I have a relative who was one of the people that was killed in the witch trials. And one of the things that I think is a real shame about history is, first of all, how badly people were recorded when they were killed. We spoke in a podcast a week ago that sometimes you just saw literally the phrase, sundry witches were executed. They weren't even given a name. And no doubt at that time, the last thing you would want to do in your family was flag up the fact that your own family member was killed as a witch for fear that something would happen to you as well. So the stories of these women and what happened to them disappeared because people weren't talking about them. I find the resurgence of interest, as you've described, Karen, in the last 15 years, really interesting, that there is this desire to find out about the women, and certainly for me, as I was thinking about it, and Zoe as well, to right the wrongs that happened to these women, to try and claim some justice for them.
Absolutely. And for me, that was a very important aspect of doing these paintings, was to sort of highlight the fact that, you know, it happened a long time ago, but it happened, and there has been no justice. I think we also have to remember there were a few men in there as well. Although I could be accused of being, you know, because I am a feminist, accused of focusing on the women. But there were, of course, men who were persecuted too, but by far mainly women. And also, I think what drove a lot of these accusations to become executions was, I think, misogyny. I think that you cannot get away from that. And I often sort of consider it to be the equivalent of, let's say, a snuff movie or the worst pornography where women are being brutally killed or certainly tortured. And if you read through these trial records, you can see absolutely what these men in power, they were getting a kick out of it too. I absolutely believe. Maybe not all, maybe some of them really thought they were doing the right thing, but there was certainly elements of rogues in there. And of course, you've got the prickers and all that kind of stuff.
That's exactly. I was going to speak about the witch prickers. Those people that were touting themselves about as the people being able to tell who was a witch and who wasn't a witch were particularly despicable. Because at least it can be said of some of the people, at least they actually believed in the devil and believed that they were getting confessions from people that actually were witches. Those were the ones that you were talking about that might have been legitimate. But when it came to the people that were no more than fairground acts, effectively pretending that they knew how to identify women as witches and coming up with all sorts of tests, they were particularly grotesque, and all of those were men. There, as far as I'm aware, and please, if anyone knows of any woman who was able to identify, in fact, I should say, I know of one woman who said that she could identify women as witches, and she was in fact famously caught out for her act, wasn't she? Somebody didn't believe that she was able to tell witches, so sent a group of people in and said, right, tell me who's the witch, and then sent the same group of people in the next day dressed in different clothes, and she identified different people as witches. And then I think she herself was accused of witchcraft, was she?
I think so. It's not something I've really focused on, but there was a woman who pretended to be a man who was a pricker.
Oh, I don't know if that's the same one. This was a woman. I'll investigate that further. Maybe we'll talk about it in another podcast. How can people see the work that you've done that we've been talking about today?
I do have a website and I do have a Facebook page and all that, but I don't edit it enough and I don't update it enough. I do have a book and I do have images up on my website, and what I should really do is update these images again every so often. So you can access a lot of these images from my website, yes.
Well, what we will do for our listeners is we will direct them on social media to your website. What's the name of your website?
It's just Karen Strang Artist. I've also got Facebook page, Instagram page, but that doesn't really cover my witchcraft work. It just covers my more general work. So yeah, my website's the best bet.
Grand. Well, we will certainly direct our listeners to be able to have a look at your work there. As I was saying to Zoe and yourself a bit earlier, I find your work so engaging, so evocative, and I was just really, really struck by it. And I'm so absolutely delighted that you're continuing your long-held interest in this work, and that you're still working to give these women voices. So thank you very, very much for all the work that you've done.
Thanks so much. That was brilliant talking to Karen. Really, really insightful. We've got fantastic guests lined up for the next few weeks as well, we're very happy to say. So the first people we're going to be speaking to in this coming week are Rachel Newton and Lauren McCall, who are going to speak to us about their forthcoming project, which is an artistic response to the Pardon Memorial. They are working together on a project called Heal and Harrow. So we'll be speaking to them about that in this coming week.
And we've also recorded with Doug Spears, archaeologist, and we're going to have a few conversations with him because the detail that he knows about the case of Lillis is absolutely fascinating. And so we want to do a deep dive into what he knows about the time of Lillis, her neighbours, her accusers, and build a real picture of the women that would have lived at that time.
So if you can just do, as we always say at the end of these podcasts, if you can tell people about what we're doing, if you can share it and spread the word, then we've got a greater chance of the campaign being successful. You'll find us on Twitter, on Instagram and on Facebook. And of course, we've got our website too. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll speak to you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.